The sun was blazing in the July heat when the iron gates of the Cannabis County Jail creaked open. Merle Everett covered his eyes with the palm of his hand, squinting against the unusually bright light. 15 years, 5,475 days he had spent behind those walls, counting off each morning with another notch on his mental calendar. Now he was free. The suddenness of the thought was overwhelming. Freedom was heavier than imprisonment in its uncertainty. Only a few hours ago, he'd been packing up the meager belongings of his cell. 3 tattered books, the photograph of Tallulah he'd kept under his mattress all these years, and a few letters he'd reread to the bone. Block Chief McGregor, a gray-haired man with a weathered face, shook his hand in farewell, a rare gesture of respect in this place. "Don't come back, Everett," was all he said to Merle, who nodded. He wasn't going back. Tallulah was waiting for him outside the shabby green Ford, the same one they'd once driven to the lake in the early years of their marriage. The car had aged as well as they had, but it still held its own. When their gazes met, it was as if time stood still. Merle stood still for a moment, gazing at the woman who had waited for him all these years. The wrinkles around her eyes had deepened, and gray was showing in her dark hair, but her smile was still the same, warm and sincere, with a slight dimple on her right cheek. "Merle," she breathed out, taking a hesitant step forward. He covered the remaining distance and wrapped his wife in his arms, inhaling the scent of her hair vanilla shampoo, just like before. A lump rose in his throat. His hands remembered the shape of her body, but it seemed more fragile now, as if the years of waiting had thinned her. "I'm home, Lula," he said hoarsely, using a nickname that no one but him dared say. "Home at last." She clung to him tighter, and he felt her shoulders shake. 15 years of waiting were now pouring out in silent tears on his shoulder. Merle stroked her back, whispering something soothing, though he could barely contain his own emotions. Cars passed around them, but it was as if the world had ceased to exist. It was just the two of them, frozen in this moment of long-awaited reunion. "Let's go home," Tallulah finally said, pulling away and wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "There's a surprise waiting for you." It took 3 hours to get to their town of Pineview. For the first hour, they barely spoke, too many years of silence separating them, too many unspoken words. Then the ice began to melt. Merle noticed the change in Tallulah's driving style. She had been more cautious before, but now she maneuvered confidently on the highway, overtaking heavy trucks. "Remember Baxter? He still lives in the neighborhood," Tallulah said, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Helped me with all the little things around the house, and with the roof the year before last when Hurricane Geraldine damaged the east side." Merle nodded, looking out at the scenery whizzing by. The world had changed as he sat there. More cell towers, new billboards, other models of cars. The radio played music he didn't recognize. Too modern, too foreign. "How's Sienna? Do you two still talk?" he asked, thinking of his wife's best friend, the 4 of them. He, Tallulah, Sienna, and her then-boyfriend, who used to have barbecues on weekends. "You bet," Tallulah smiled. "She's the head nurse at our clinic now. She was promoted 3 years ago when the old Martha Wilson finally retired. You'd be surprised, but she's still single. Says the men in Pineview aren't up to her standards." "What happened to that guy? What's his name? Jeremy?" "Riley. Went off to some 20-year-old waitress," Tallulah snorted. "Classic story. Bought a red sports car, grew a mustache, and decided he deserved a second youth. Sienna sobbed for 2 weeks, then burned all his stuff in the backyard and vowed not to get involved with emotionally immature middle-aged men anymore. Her words, not mine," she added with a slight smile. Merle chuckled, imagining the scene. Sienna had always been a passionate person. If she loved, it was to the point of madness. If she hated, it was to the core. "What else has changed while I've been away?" he asked, looking at the familiar shape of the hills surrounding Pineview. "Who's the mayor now? Same old Harrison, won his 4th election in a row, can you believe it? And his son's chief of police now replaced old Donovan 2 years ago. They say it's a slam dunk, but you gotta admit, the kid's doing a good job." They drove up to the house as the sun began to sink toward the horizon, coloring the sky pinkish orange. The small 2-story cottage with the veranda looked almost exactly as it had in Merle's memories, except that the fence had been repainted from blue to white, and the old maple tree at the corner of the lot had grown even larger, casting a thick shadow over half the lawn. The garden gnomes Tallulah had always collected now lined the path to the house, silent guardians of their family hearth. "Surprise!" Tallulah exclaimed as she opened the door. Waiting for them in the living room were several people with festive hubcaps and a banner that read, "Welcome back, Merle!" Ceiling garlands cast a warm glow on the table, set with appetizers and drinks. Merle froze on the threshold, stunned by the sudden attention. He hadn't been prepared for this many people at once, not after 15 years of isolation, where any cluster of prisoners meant potential danger. "I didn't realize we'd be greeted," he muttered, awkwardly adjusting the collar of the shirt Tallulah had brought him to leave the prison. "I thought a little party would be nice." Tallulah took his hand under hers, stroking it soothingly on his forearm. "Only those closest to you. Everyone has been looking forward to your return, Merle." Baxter Holt stepped forward first. In 15 years, he'd grown broader at the shoulders, his bald spot more extensive, and his reddish beard a silvery hue. But his eyes remained the same, shrewd, assessing, with a sparkle that could be mistaken for friendliness if you didn't know him better. "Welcome back to the world of the living, old boy." He shook Merle's hand firmly, a little longer than propriety demanded. "You don't know how Lula has waited for this day." She counted the months, then the weeks, then the days. Even kept a special calendar last year. Merle nodded, trying not to notice how easily Baxter used his wife's shortened name. Only those closest to her called her Lula, and Baxter clearly included himself in that circle. "Thanks for looking after her while I was away," Merle said, keeping his expression neutral. He'd learned to hide his emotions in prison. It was a matter of survival. "Come on." Baxter clapped him on the shoulder. "We're neighbors. Besides, Tallulah's a wonderful woman. Anyone would be proud of that kind of friendship." Merle sensed a subtext in his words, but he shook off the suspicion. 15 years in a cell had taught him to see threat everywhere, a habit he had to break. Sienna McIntyre came up next, elegant and slender, with sharp features and a short haircut she hadn't worn before. She wore a simple black dress, emphasizing her figure, and a minimum of makeup. Sienna always preferred naturalness. "Merle Everett himself." She hugged him and stepped back, scrutinizing him with her penetrating brown eyes. "Prison hasn't broken you, I see, still as stubborn and straightforward as ever." "I'm not that easy to break," he joked, though something inside shuddered at her words. If she'd known what really happened to him behind bars, she wouldn't have been so sure. "That's right," Sienna nodded. "I remember when you refused to go to the doctor with that broken finger when we were building that shed in the backyard." "It's just a bruise," she mocked his voice. "Then you put up with it for 2 days until Tallulah made you go for x-rays." Merle smiled, remembering that incident. 10 years ago? No, more like 2 years before his arrest. Life had seemed so simple and straightforward then. The evening dragged on slowly, talking, reminiscing, asking questions about future plans. Merle felt like an actor who'd forgotten a part in the middle of a play. 15 years was too long. Too much had changed in a city he'd once known like the back of his hand. The new mall on the site of the old movie theater, the closing of the Anderson factory, the death of old Dr. Finch, the mayor's daughter's wedding, the embezzlement scandal on the city council. The stories followed one after another, and Merle nodded and smiled, feeling like an outsider among the people he'd once called friends. "I work at Jenkins' auto shop," Baxter said, filling glasses with wine. Merle saw him move closer to Tallulah, as if he hadn't meant to. "If you need a job, I can put in a good word. Merwin's always looking for good mechanics. You used to be pretty good with motors, didn't you?" "Thanks," Merle nodded, taking a sip of wine, his first in 15 years. It tasted familiar and strange at the same time. "But I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet. I need to get settled in first." "Take your time." Tallulah squeezed his hand reassuringly, and there was so much tenderness in the gesture that Merle's heart sank. "We have savings. Look around first. Get used to it. The head of my library said they need a housekeeper, but it can wait." Merle nodded gratefully. The thought of plunging right into the daily grind scared him. He hadn't yet gotten used to the idea that he could decide when to wake up, what to eat, and where to go. Speaking of adjustment, Sienna intervened, sitting down with a glass of mineral water. The reintegration program at the clinic offers free counseling for returning prisoners. It helps a lot of people adjust. There are group sessions and individual sessions with a psychologist. I could sign you up if you'd like. Merle noticed her exchanging quick glances with Tallulah, and it didn't escape him. Years spent among the prisoners had sharpened his powers of observation. "Were you discussing me?" he asked bluntly, feeling the irrational irritation rising inside him. "Not discussing, but preparing for your return," Tallulah countered softly, stroking his tense hand. "It is normal to seek support from friends. I wanted everything to go as smoothly as possible for you." "We're all worried about you, Merle," Sienna added. 15 years is no joke. Tallulah said you were reluctant to talk about life inside in your letters." The doorbell rang. The pizza was delivered. The order was from the new pizza place on the corner of Maple Street and Oak Avenue, where the dry cleaner used to be. Merle remembered picking up his only weekend suit there, the same one he'd later worn to court. The conversation moved on, but Merle couldn't escape the feeling that he was in a strange play where everyone knew the script but him. When the guests left around midnight, the house finally fell into silence. An unaccustomed silence, no clanking of bars, no muffled conversations or moans from neighboring cells, no stomping of warders down the corridor. Merle stood at the bedroom window, looking out at the moonlit street. From the neighboring house came the muffled barking of a dog. Baxter must have gotten a pet. For 15 years, Merle had dreamed of this moment, of being home again, with Tallulah in their bedroom. Now that the dream had come true, he felt a strange emptiness. It was as if a part of him had stayed there, behind bars, never to return. "What are you thinking?" Tallulah came up behind him, wrapped her arms around his waist. She smelled of lavender soap and a little wine. She had changed into a nightgown, light blue, lace-edged, new. Merle didn't remember it in his wife's closet before her imprisonment. "About how things had changed," he answered honestly, "and how nothing has changed. The street's the same, the houses are the same, but everything seems different, even you." She rested her head on his shoulder, and he felt the warmth of her body through the thin fabric of the t-shirt he'd changed into before bed. "We'll get through this, Merle, day by day, one step at a time. You'll feel at home again, I promise." He turned and kissed her, gently, almost tentatively, as if he were relearning this language. Tallulah responded, just as tentatively at first, then more insistently, and something familiar flared between them, a desire that had not faded in 15 years of separation. "I missed you every day," she whispered, pulling away. Her eyes glistened in the moonlight. "Every night I imagined you were near." Merle ran his fingers over her cheek, tracing the outline of her face like a blind man recognizing the features he loved by touch. "Thinking about you kept me from going crazy," he admitted, "especially in the early years." The following weeks became a slow dance of reconnecting and getting to know each other all over again. Merle took a job with a construction company, not as a mechanic, as Baxter had suggested, but as a laborer. He liked being physically tired, coming home with aching muscles, taking a shower, and feeling the tension leave his body. The job didn't require much socializing, another plus, considering most social skills had dulled over the years of confinement. Baxter stopped by often, whether to bring some tools, offer to help with garage repairs, or just to have a beer on the porch. Merle noticed the way he looked at Tallulah, with a tenderness that went beyond ordinary friendship, but he remained silent. 15 years was a long time. He couldn't blame his wife if there was something between them. The important thing was that she had waited for him, that they were together now. In the evenings, he and Tallulah would sit on the veranda, drink tea, she with mint, he with lemon, and talk about everything and nothing. She talked about her job at the library, about her niece growing up and going off to college, about the new shopping center on the outskirts of town, about how she'd managed all these years. Merle listened, asked questions, but when it came to his experience in prison, he gave short, vague sentences. "It was hard the first 3 years. Then I got used to it," he said, averting his eyes. "The regime, you know. Wake up, breakfast, work, lunch, work again, dinner, bedtime, day after day, the same thing." After a while, you stop noticing. Worked in a laundry. Nice place, away from the main population, he replied to her questions about his prison life. The head warden McGregor patronized me, said I was different. In a good way? No, I didn't make any special friends. Best to keep a low profile in a place like this, he dismissed when she asked about other prisoners. Talked to a couple of guys from the workshop, but we weren't close. In prison, trust is a luxury few can afford. One night, a month after their return, they had a romantic dinner. Merle bought candles and wine. Tallulah cooked his favorite eggplant lasagna. On the table was a picture from their wedding. Very young, they looked at the camera with carefree smiles. Tallulah had been 23 at the time, Merle 27. They saw a lifetime of opportunity ahead of them. After dinner, they danced in the living room to old tunes from the 80s that they had once loved. Merle moved awkwardly, not much dancing in prison, but Tallulah led him patiently, and gradually his body remembered the forgotten moves. "Remember our honeymoon in the mountains?" Tallulah whispered, as they swayed slowly to the beat of the music. Her head rested on his chest, and he could feel her heart beating. "How did we get lost on that trail and come to a lake of crystal clear water?" "And you insisted we go swimming," Merle smiled, ruffling her hair, even though the water was icy cold. "And then we shivered in the cold, wrapped up in the same blanket, and watched the sun go down behind the mountains. And you said it was the best day of your life." He pulled her tighter against him, closing her eyes so she wouldn't see the tears that had suddenly come. And so it was. Later, as the ancient clock in the parlor struck midnight, Tallulah fell asleep in his arms. Merle carefully disentangled himself and tiptoed into the bathroom. Locking the door, he pulled a small orange jar of pills from the hidden pocket of his jeans. He swallowed one with tap water and carefully hid it in the ceiling vent. The jar was almost empty. There were only a few pills left. Soon he would have to find a way to replenish the supply without arousing suspicion. He took a long look at his reflection in the mirror. Wrinkles, graying temples, a scar above his left eyebrow, a memory of a fight in his second year of incarceration. But the main change was on the inside, invisible but inexorable. "You all right, Merle?" Tallulah's sleepy voice came from the bedroom. "Yeah, I'm on my way," he replied, taking another look at his reflection. The man looking back at him from the mirror looked older than his 52 years. There was an anxiety in his eyes that he had carefully hidden from his wife during the day. Some secrets are best kept to oneself, he had decided years ago, especially those that could destroy hard-won happiness. October was unusually cold. The trees along Maple Street were shedding their last leaves, and Pineview's janitors had no time to remove them. The 3 months flew by. Merle was getting used to his work schedule at the construction company, and Tallulah was enjoying their restored family life. From the outside, everything seemed perfect, a love story that had stood the test of long separation. "Merle, would you pass the salt?" Tallulah asked at dinner, blotting her lips with a napkin. She looked tired. Sleep had been difficult for the past few weeks, and she woke up in the morning shattered. "Are you not feeling well?" Merle asked, watching his wife barely touch her portion of roast. "Just fatigue. We're busy at the library, preparing for the literary festival. It's not often we get famous authors to come here." Merle nodded, but he didn't believe it. Tallulah had lost weight in the last week, shadows under her eyes, and her skin had taken on an unhealthy yellowish tint. Sometimes at night he could hear her coughing quietly in the bathroom, trying not to wake him. On Friday, Tallulah returned home with Sienna. The friends were sitting on the veranda, wrapped in plaids, drinking tea when Merle drove up to the house after his shift. "Here's our builder," Sienna smiled, greeting him with a nod. "How's the progress on the new shopping center?" Slowly but surely, Merle kissed Tallulah's cheek, noting to himself that she was hot. "Do you have a fever?" "No, it's just a hot drink," Tallulah said, but Sienna gave her a concerned look. "Lula, tell him," she said softly. "Tell him what?" Merle shifted his gaze from one woman to the other. Tallulah sighed, setting her cup on the small table. "I haven't been feeling well these past weeks. Sienna thinks I should get a checkup." "Not just think, but insist," Sienna corrected, and for the first time Merle could hear the professional tone of a nurse in her voice. Increased fatigue, weight loss, night sweats. It could just be stress or vitamin deficiency, but it's best to get it checked out." "Of course it should be checked out," Merle encouraged, sitting down next to his wife. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to worry you." Tallulah smiled weakly. "You already have so much to worry about with the adjustment, the new job." "I've made an appointment with Dr. Greenwood for Monday," Sienna said as she left. "We'll do some general blood work first, maybe prescribe some vitamins." When Sienna left, Merle took Tallulah's hands in his. "Promise me you won't keep things like this from me anymore," he asked. "We're a team, remember?" She nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. "I do. It's just, I'm scared, Merle. Something's wrong with my body. I can feel it." Merle hugged her, trying to hide his own anxiety. A cold, clammy feeling of guilt settled inside. He suspected something, but pushed the worst thoughts away. The weekend passed in anxious anticipation. On Sunday, Baxter dropped by with apple pie. Hilda Richardson had shared the recipe. "Thought you'd appreciate it," he explained, handing Tallulah an aluminum mold. "You started baking pies?" Merle wondered, raising an eyebrow. "Don't tell me it goes against my brutal nature." Baxter grinned, helping Tallulah carry the pie into the kitchen. "How are you feeling?" "A little pale." "I'm all right," she said, but she swayed when Baxter caught her elbow. "You need to lie down," he said, in a tone that brooked no objection. "Merle, make her some tea and honey, and I'll help her to the couch." Merle gritted his teeth as he watched his neighbor gently lead his wife into the living room, as if he'd done it 1,000 times. The possessive overtones in Baxter's demeanor were becoming more and more obvious. "Thanks for your concern, but I can take care of my wife myself," Merle said when they were alone in the kitchen. Baxter looked at him carefully. "Of course you can. But for 15 years I've been here when you couldn't. Old habits are hard to eradicate." There was no challenge in his words, but Merle heard the unspoken, "I was around when you weren't." It struck a nerve. "Times have changed," Merle replied dryly. "I'm home now." "That's right," Baxter nodded. "And that's what counts." Monday came all too quickly. Merle had asked to leave work to take Tallulah to the clinic, but she'd insisted on going with Sienna. "It's just routine tests," she urged. "Besides, Sienna knows all the doctors. She'll get me in without waiting in line. Go back to work. Don't waste the day." Merle reluctantly agreed, but he couldn't concentrate all day. The phone was silent, and that bothered him even more. When he got home, Tallulah was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at one point. "What did the doctor say?" Merle asked, and from the look on her face he realized what he feared most had happened. "They took a lot of tests." Tallulah's voice sounded distant, like she was talking about someone else. Sienna had gotten Dr. Greenwood to check everything, including HIV. Merle sank into the chair opposite, unable to breathe. The test was positive." She finally looked him in the eye. "I have HIV, Merle. They double-checked." Time seemed to stop. The room swam before his eyes. Merle knew this moment would come, but he wasn't ready. "It's impossible," he said hoarsely. "There must be a mistake." "There is no mistake." Tallulah shook her head. "Dr. Greenwood says, judging by the state of the immune system, the infection is relatively recent. During the last..." Her voice trembled. "The last 6 months." Merle covered his face with his hands. 6 months, that meant since his return. Cornered, he could only confess. "Lula, there's something I need to tell you," he began, gathering the remnants of his courage. "No." Tallulah stood up abruptly. "Don't you dare call me Lula. Not now." "Tallulah, please listen. It's you, isn't it?" Her voice was ringing with tension. "You infected me? How? Where?" The words stuck in her throat, but there was no retreat. "In prison. 3rd year, there was a fight. I got stabbed with a shiv, a homemade knife. Not too bad, but, contaminated blood." Tallulah made a sound like a strangled scream. "You knew? All this time you knew and kept silent?" Merle nodded, unable to utter a word. "How long?" she asked demandingly. "How long did you know?" 10 years, he squeezed out. "I was diagnosed in the prison hospital." 10 years, Tallulah repeated, as if she couldn't believe her ears. "And you didn't tell me. You didn't warn me. You came home to my bed knowing you were sick?" "I was on medication," Merle excused himself. The viral load was undetectable. The doctor said the risk of transmission was minimal. Minimal? She laughed a crazy laugh. You were playing Russian roulette with my life. Every time we were close, you... She couldn't finish the sentence, choking on her sobs. Merle tried to approach, to put his arms around her, but Tallulah recoiled as if from a leper. Don't touch me, she screamed. Never touch me again. Tallulah, please, let's talk. Talk about what? There was pure rage in her eyes. You've been lying to me all this time. You've been hiding it. And I, the fool, waited 15 years for you. Denying everyone, being faithful. The last words hurt the most. Merle lowered his head. I was afraid you'd turn on me if you found out. You were right to be afraid. Tallulah grabbed the first thing she could get her hands on, a ceramic vase, and threw it at the wall. The vase shattered. Get out! Get out of my house! Tallulah, this is our home. Not anymore! She pointed to the door with a trembling hand. You have 1 hour to pack your things and disappear. Otherwise, I'm calling the police. There was such determination in her eyes that Merle realized it was useless to argue. Silently, he went up to the bedroom and began packing his things into an old suitcase. Every item seemed to be a reminder of a ruined life. The shirt Tallulah had given him for his first month back, the book with her notes in the margins, the framed photograph of them together. When he came downstairs with his suitcase, he saw Tallulah sitting at her desk, clutching her phone. I've already called my lawyer, she announced in a lifeless voice. I'll send the divorce papers tomorrow. Merle nodded. He had no right to ask for more. Where will you go? She asked, and in that question flashed the last reminder that they had once loved each other. I don't know, Merle answered honestly. Maybe a motel for starters. Sienna offered to stay with her, Tallulah said without looking at him. But you'd better stay away from me. Merle nodded, feeling the last thread that bound them together break. At the door, he turned around. I'm sorry, Tallulah. If I could make things right, but you can't. She shook her head. No one can, now go. With a heavy heart, Merle walked out into the October night. The rain poured down in a wall, as if nature was mourning his loss. Not knowing where to go, he wandered down the familiar road to the only man who could shelter him, Baxter. 15 minutes later, he stood on the porch of a neighboring house, drenched to the skin. Baxter opened the door and stared at the unexpected guest in silence. I've ruined everything, Merle said. Tallulah kicked me out. She called. Baxter nodded. She told me. There was condemnation in his gaze, mixed with pity. Do you need a place to sleep? If I can, Merle lowered his head. Just for a couple days until I find a place to stay. Baxter hesitated a moment, struggling with his inner contradictions, but then opened the door wider. Come on in. The guest bedroom is upstairs, first door on the left. Thank you, Merle breathed out, stepping over the threshold. Don't thank me, Baxter replied dryly. I'm not doing this for you. There was an obvious implication in those words. Baxter cared for Tallulah. Perhaps she'd asked him to shelter Merle so he wouldn't end up on the streets. I see, Merle nodded. The guest room was small and ascetic: a bed, a dresser, a chair, and a small window overlooking the backyard. Placing his suitcase on the floor, Merle sat on the edge of the bed, feeling completely devastated. In one night, he had lost everything he had held on to all these years: his wife, his home, his hope for a normal life. A ragged issue of the local newspaper lay on the bedside table. Merle picked it up, flipping through the pages without reading the headlines. Sleep did not come, though the fatigue was a leaden weight. Movement was heard downstairs. Baxter was on the phone, and though the words were indistinct, the tone sounded excited. A few minutes later, the front door slammed. The master of the house had gone somewhere. Unable to lie idle, Merle went down to the kitchen. He opened the refrigerator, but there was no appetite. There was an unfinished bottle of whiskey on the table. Merle poured some into a glass and sat by the window, looking out at the rain. Time stretched agonizingly slow. 11 p.m. midnight, 1 o'clock at night. Baxter did not return. At one point, Merle dozed off in his chair but was awakened by the shrill ringing of a cell phone. The number was unidentifiable. Merle pressed the green button. Hello? Merle? Sienna's voice sounded strange. Where are you? At Baxter's. Why? Stay there, don't go anywhere. She sounded panicked. The police are on their way. The police? Sienna, what's going on? Long pause, heavy breathing on the phone. Tallulah found Baxter outside her house. He's dead, Merle. Somebody killed him. The glass fell out of Merle's hand, shattering on the tile floor. The rain didn't stop all night. By morning, the streets of Pineview had turned to muddy streams. The wail of police sirens cut through the pre-dawn silence, jolting residents out of a restless slumber. Detective Aldous Fletcher arrived on the scene at 4 a.m. A lean man with shrewd gray eyes and prematurely graying temples, he'd spent 20 years on the police force of a major city before returning to his native Pineview. Body found at 2345, the young officer reported, leading the detective to the fenced-in lot outside Tallulah Everett's house. The homeowner had called 911 after hearing noises in the backyard. Baxter Holt's body was lying face down in the rain-soaked ground. The medical examiner, Dr. Lorraine Fisher, was squatting next to the corpse. Cause of death? Fletcher asked, pulling on latex gloves. Preliminary, multiple stab wounds to the back and neck, at least 7 stab wounds. The murder weapon was some kind of screwdriver or an awl. Time of death? Between 9 o'clock and 10 p.m., I'll know more after the autopsy. Fletcher sat down, scrutinizing the body. There's hardly any signs of a struggle. He knew his attacker, turned his back on him. Or attacker, Lorraine corrected. Don't rule out women, Aldous. Tallulah Everett was sitting on the couch, wrapped in a blanket. Beside her, Sienna McIntyre held a glass of water. Mrs. Everett, Fletcher introduced himself, showing his badge. I need to ask you some questions. She's in shock, Sienna intervened. I gave her a light sedative. Unfortunately, the first hours after a murder are critical, the detective replied. The sooner we start the investigation, the better chance we have of finding the killer. Tallulah looked up tiredly. I won't be able to sleep anyway, ask me. Tell me what happened last night. I kicked my husband out of the house. We had a serious conflict of a personal nature. When did this happen? Around 8 p.m. Merle went to Baxter's. They're neighbors. I was alone. Then I called Sienna. And you both stayed here? Yes, Tallulah confirmed. We were in the kitchen drinking tea. Then I heard a noise from the backyard and I looked out the window. I saw Baxter's body. Mr. Holt was a close friend of yours? Yes, Baxter helped me all those years Merle was in prison. Were you two romantically involved? No, I was faithful to my husband for 15 years. Baxter never crossed the line, although I think he was in love with me. Did your husband know about this? He must have known, I suppose. But we never discussed it directly. Where is your husband now? I don't know, Tallulah answered honestly. He's gone to Baxter, but I'm not thinking about anything yet, Fletcher assured her. I'm just gathering information. Could you call your husband? Merle answered after a few rings, and Fletcher asked him to stay at Baxter's house. What kind of personal conflict are you having with your husband? It could be important to the investigation. Tallulah lowered her eyes. He gave me HIV, hid his diagnosis for 10 years. I only found out yesterday. Merle Everett opened the door, looking gaunt. Baxter's living room was dark. Mr. Everett, Fletcher held out his hand. I'm sorry to break the bad news, but Baxter Holt is dead. He was killed last night outside your wife's house. Murdered? But how? Who? Tell me where you were between 8 o'clock and 11 o'clock last night. I got here around 8:30. Tallulah kicked me out of the house after an argument. Baxter was reluctant to let me spend the night. You stayed here the whole time? At first, yes. Baxter showed me to the guest room and went downstairs. I heard him talking on the phone, then he left. It was about 9 o'clock. What did you do after he left? Went down to the kitchen, had some whiskey, then fell asleep in the chair. Woke up to a call from Sienna. Can anyone confirm that you stayed in the house? No, I was alone. Did you have a conflict with Mr. Holt? Not conflict, more like, tension. He was close to Tallulah while I was sitting. Were you jealous? Perhaps, but not enough to kill him. There was unusual activity at Pineview Police Station. Fletcher was locked in his office, reviewing preliminary forensic results. The murder weapon was a screwdriver with a long, thin stinger. There were no prints on the handle, so the killer wore gloves. Officer Jenkins brought in files on everyone involved. Merle Everett, 52 years old. Convicted 15 years ago for armed robbery. 10 years ago, He was diagnosed with HIV after an incident with another inmate. Tallulah Everett, 48 years old, librarian, waited 15 years for her husband. Baxter Holt, 55, car mechanic, widower. Sienna McIntyre, 36, head nurse at the city clinic, specializing in infectious diseases. Tallulah was the first person called in for questioning. When did you find out about your husband's HIV status? Yesterday afternoon. Sienna insisted on a full workup. When it came back positive, I demanded an answer, and he confessed. How did Baxter react when he found out? I didn't tell Baxter. Maybe Sienna told him. Merle was next. He told of his strained relationship with Baxter and his suspicions about his feelings for Tallulah. Sienna was questioned last. You were the first to know of Tallulah's diagnosis? Yes. I was with her when the results came back. Did you tell Baxter about it? I may have mentioned it in a conversation last night. He called to see how Tallulah was. What time was that? About 9 o'clock, maybe a little before. And what did Baxter say? He was shocked. He said it was unforgivable. Miss McIntyre, where were you between 9 o'clock and 10 p.m.? With Tallulah, at her house. Tallulah claims you went out to get some air for about half an hour. Sienna went pale. I used to go out on the porch to smoke, but not for long. How far away from Tallulah's house did you go? I didn't. Detective, you don't think... Unlike Merle Everett, you have no alibi for the time of the murder. 3 days later, Fletcher called everyone into his office. The investigation into the murder of Baxter Holt is complete. A search of his home revealed traces of blood in the bathroom sink. In addition, a screwdriver with traces of his blood was found, thoroughly washed. The prints on the handle belonged to Baxter himself. What? Tallulah exclaimed. How could he kill himself? He couldn't, but he could have staged the attack. Baxter learns of Tallulah's diagnosis and decides to take revenge on Merle. He inflicts several superficial wounds on himself, calls Tallulah, and goes to her house, faking an attack. Why? Merle asks. To set you up, you go back to prison and he gets Tallulah's sympathy. But Baxter's dead, Sienna objected. How could superficial wounds kill him? He was killed by an allergic reaction to the drug you, Miss McIntyre, injected him with in an attempt to help him. Sienna turned pale. I don't understand. When you went out for a smoke, you saw Baxter on the ground. As a nurse, you administered first aid, unaware of his allergy to a component of the medication. The reaction was fatal. I wanted to help, Sienna whispered. He was panting, his face turning blue. I gave him epinephrine. I didn't know he was allergic. Why didn't you call an ambulance? I panicked. When I realized he was dead, that I'd accidentally killed a man, I ran back, told Tallulah I heard a noise. You lied to me? Tallulah looked at her friend with horror. I'm sorry. I was afraid. The autopsy showed that Baxter died of anaphylactic shock. His medical records show he was allergic to epinephrine. What happens now? Tallulah asked. Miss McIntyre will be charged with manslaughter. Given the circumstances, the punishment will probably be minimal. What about Baxter's plan? Merle asked. There was a folder found in his computer with material on you. Your prison schedule, photographs, travel patterns. He's been preparing. Merle and Tallulah walked out of the police station on a cloudy day. What now? Merle asked. I don't know. But it's definitely not us. We're done. I'm sorry. I really am. Me too. Goodbye, Merle. 6 months later, Tallulah looked at the test results. The therapy had worked. The viral load had become undetectable. She left her job at the library and became the coordinator of a support group for HIV-positive people. The divorce from Merle was finalized quickly. The house was sold, splitting the money. Tallulah started her life with a clean slate. Merle moved to a neighboring state. He got a job in a sawmill. He sent Tallulah a check every month to help with her medical bills. Sienna got 2 years probation and lost her medical license. Their friendship with Tallulah never recovered. On the last day of spring, Tallulah received a letter from Merle. Tallulah, I hope you are well. I found a good doctor. Every day I think about you and what I could have done differently. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I know I don't deserve it. I just want you to know, I wish you happiness. Merle. She folded the letter and put it away in a drawer. There was no point in dredging up the past. Too late for regrets. Too late for forgiveness. Life went on. Changed, but still worth living.